I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. Well, Bill, the government shutdown has continued to linger on with no end in sight. And when we say shutdown, I feel like we have to give a 5-minute dissertation on what that actually means. But we're just going to forego that for today and ask an interesting question. This idea specifically came to me from a website called fee.org, Fee.org. And if I were better read and more widely traveled, I'd know what that stands for. But they were reprinting an article that came from the Mises Institute. And I've heard of Mises. And in fact, I was inoculated against it when I was a kid. But it was written by one Ryan McMakin, who says that the government, the federal government, should turn over all of the national parks to state and local authorities and perhaps even private businesses. That's the lesson of this federal, or one of the lessons of this federal shutdown. Bill, it seems to me that this is the kind of guy who would like to see a great big oil derrick right next to Old Faithful in Yosemite Park. Is he not?
Yeah. Funny how whenever you try to phrase a question from the left, you manage to connect oil and greed somehow to any single thing, as if the federal government isn't the greediest and least efficient entity in these United States of America. Having the states run the parks is no different than having the national government run the parks. I have to say, in this particular case, I don't know that it's an enormous deal. I don't think that our national parks cost that much money in the grand scheme of things. And to be honest with you, it does seem to me to be one of the legitimate purviews of the federal government. At the very least, I mean, certainly it's not in the Constitution, but at least not that I'm aware of. But at the very least, it has got to be one of the least intrusive and most pleasant aspects of the federal government. And it's not like we're printing money to keep the national parks open. So I think
how wrong you are, Bill. So here's the problem, because at the state level, Ryan McMakin's making this case, that the problem comes when, for example, right now, the federal government's budget cutbacks mean that they have put signs up on national parks that say that they are closed. But that doesn't stop people from really going in. It's not like the Obama administration where they posted armed guards to keep people out of the national parks. And as a result of that, and the fact that toilets are locked and porta potties are overflowing, trash is being strewn hither and yon, and local businesses are being deprived of income who give tours and provide other adventures around those state parks. So actually, it's having a huge impact because some group of people out in Washington, D.C. have decided that the folks in Colorado can't enjoy the national park.
Well, so once again, it's not a national park service problem, and it's not a lack of funding for the parks, and it's not the federal ownership of the parks that's the problem, or at least the federal management of the parks, presumably the people in the parks. It's the fact that the federal government doesn't function anymore and hasn't functioned for a very long time. You're old enough to remember a quaint term from back in the previous century called Gramm-Rudman spending limits. Remember those?
Yes.
Where they basically said the government is not capable of controlling its own spending. So we're going to pass legislation in the name of, I guess it was Senator Graham and Rudman, automatically limiting how much money the government could spend. And when it got to that limit, that was the end of it. Well, what continued to happen was the evolution of this aneurysm, this ever-growing federal aneurysm, worked something like that. You had a government that was relatively, I don't want to say frugal exactly, but they didn't have just pots of money that belonged to nobody, so they had to account for it. And I clearly remember that in World War, not personally, but I remember that in World War II, we had to constantly have these bond drives in order to fund the war. This is an existential war for our existence, and the federal government, instead of just printing money, had to go to the American people and issue a bond, which meant that they would get, what was it, $4 for every 3 or something like that. So that's a sane and healthy government. And over time, as the government got richer and richer and as federal programs began to expand, and as the Democrats made the social compact of basically saying, vote for us and we'll give you free stuff, which is not free, but is paid for by other people, this money hole started to gain mass, and now it's reached the event horizon where it is no longer possible to describe what the federal government does in any rational economic terms whatsoever.
But
So
Bill,
not
haven't
only
you just made the very argument that the federal government can't be trusted with the national parks, if only because they can't possibly ever solve that partisan divide and they will always mismanage the budget?
Well, yes, certainly. And to that degree, I suppose, look, yes, okay, I mean, that's fine. And I don't have any particular problem with the states running them or anything like that. I'm just saying that the federal park issue is the most immediately felt tip of the iceberg of this enormous, unworkable, infeasible, impossible federal structure that we have. It's the tip of the iceberg that the people get to connect to. And by the way, when you take a look at what DHS costs and the national parks cost, when these are the first things to get shut down, and this was true during the Obama years especially, as you said, Obama not only just closed the parks, he had armed guards to prevent people from going into the Lincoln Monument and so on. This is the government's way of hitting back at the people. When the people, through their audacity, for whatever reason, try to do anything to either limit the spending or do anything to control it, the first thing the federal government does is slap the people as hard as they can in the face. It's not that the Department of Homeland Security or the National Park Service is the greatest draw on our national resources. Far from it. But they're the ones that they decide to close first until the American people come to their senses and allow them to spend as much of the people's money as they want to and just continue on with these ways.
Well, as a little R Republican and a conservative and a constitutionalist, I mean, think about this. The framers of the Constitution were so into decentralization, they didn't even want the national army centralized. Don't you think we should push things down to the local level as much as possible?
Of course I do. And I don't think the founders would have, I'm not sure what they would have thought about the whole idea of a national park in the first place. But the reason I'm pushing back on this one is because on some level, Scott, it's the bellwether. It's something of a canary in the coal mine, you know. So look, let me restate my position based on your input. Yes, let's pass the national parks down to the states, and let's pass every other damn thing down to the states too. Everything that is not national defense, let's push it down to the states. National defense in the interstate highway system, that's all. And you can make a case against the interstate highway system. So if you're talking about the national parks leading the charge to get everything out of Washington and back to the states, and not only am I in support of it, I've got a yard sign for it. But the reason that I was arguing that the national parks are not the problem is because they're not the problem. They're a symptom of the problem. And until the problem gets solved, I don't know what good taking some of these symptoms out of the body are. You know, if taking the national parks down to the state level solved our federal problems, I'm with it on theoretical terms. But some part of me is saying, if they can't run the national parks, which you'd have to admit would have to be among the easier jobs that a $4 trillion government would be tasked with, you would think that wouldn't be the most complex or difficult thing on the list. If they can't do that, then what can they do?
I can see that, and it seems like a fair argument to me that you're making, which is basically the body has a blood disease. Don't just cut off fingers. That's not the key to solving the blood disease.
That's basically what I'm saying. The key to solving the blood disease is to cut off not just a finger, which is the National Park Service. If you want to cure the patient, I would recommend amputating the finger of the National Park Service, and then I would amputate all the rest of the fingers, and I'd amputate the toes as well. Then I'd start on the lower legs and the lower arms. I'd work my way up to the shoulders and the thighs, and when you had essentially just no body, no heart, nothing, just the reptilian complex, you know, just the little R brain.
The lizard brain.
Yeah, the lizard brain. We'd leave that in Washington where it belongs, and we'd rename the city into Arnoldsville, and we'd have something a little more appropriate for George Washington's legacy. But until then, it seems to me that the National Park Service is, as if we want to run this analogy into the ground, and certainly I like to run everything into the ground, what the National Park Service is it's a gangrenous toe or finger that we can look at and say, my God, this is horrible. I mean, this is just look how sick we are. So it's not the parks, as I say, are a symptom of a much, 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 much more serious problem. And to the degree that I would like people to continue to go to the parks, and certainly to the degree that I'd like the businesses around there to do it, I'd say let's go ahead and do it. And the more I think about it, Scott, the better I like the idea, because we never know what questions we're going to get on this show. But the more I think about it, the more I begin to realize, okay, let's do that. That's a simple thing to do. It's not a terribly expensive thing to do. And when we pull the National Park Service out of the federal government and it works better, then maybe we'll think about pulling the Department of TSA anyway, Transportation Security Agency. Maybe we can put those back in the hands of private businesses that work for those particular airlines. And the reason I say that is because the TSA, for anybody who's traveled, is just a standing army of people. And I would be okay with it. I'd be okay with the inefficiencies. I'd be okay with most. I would not be okay with some of these egregious searches and things like that. But as a general rule, you have to have some kind of security if you're going to fly in a pressurized bubble at 7 miles above the earth, moving at 550 miles an hour. It's not unreasonable to me. But when you find out that the standing army that is so intrusive and so nasty to deal with and so inefficient, when you find out that an internal survey finds that they catch 5% of the fake bombs and pistols, they don't miss 5%. It's not missing 5% would be alarming. Missing 95% is hilarious. And if it wasn't so tragic. So yeah, on reflection, let's pull the parks out. Couldn't do any worse than this. And the reason I say you couldn't do any worse than this is because if you move TSA back into the hands of Delta Airlines and everybody else, you would have a certainly more efficient process. And for those people who'd say, well, the private companies would be, they wouldn't be as careful as the federal government because they try to minimize their costs and maximize their profits. The federal government is minimizing their costs. They're hiring a bunch of people. And frankly, Scott, I cannot imagine any private company that doesn't do better than a 95% failure rate.
Well, the terrorists only have to be right 95 times out of 100.
That's right.
Wait a minute. That wasn't the expression.
That's right. And what we find, of course, is not to burn the point into the ground, but basically what we find is if TSA is missing 95% of the potential bombs and pistols that are used as controls to test the effectiveness of the TSA, then you're forced to look at the remainder. And what the remainder shows you is that not to my knowledge, the TSA has never stopped anybody with a bomb. The TSA has made grandmothers disrobe and body searched little 4-year-olds, but it hasn't ever really caught anybody that I'm aware of trying to sneak a bomb on the plane. The thing that prevents terrorist attacks after 9/11 is the will and the courage of the common American citizen that happens to be traveling on that plane that day. And just because this needs to be said as often as possible, Flight 93 on 9/11 was our junior varsity girls team up against the national champions from the other side, and we kicked their asses in 45 minutes. And the reason that Flight 93 didn't hit its target was because Flight 93 was the only one of those 4 airplanes that actually knew that was going to happen. If the other planes knew what was going to happen, they wouldn't have hit their targets either because of the courage of the American people. And if this is what this discussion leads to, then we're actually have a chance to make this country into what it used to be again.
Ladies and gentlemen, when we launched Bill Whittle Now, the idea was that I would essentially ambush Bill with the news of the day and ask him questions related to specific events with no heads up in advance, because we wanted to see what conservative principles can do when meeting up with the day-to-day vicissitudes of life. And one of the things you saw on this episode was something you almost never see in the public square, which is a pundit, so to speak, considering an argument, rethinking his own position, and not just doubling down and rejecting the other side because he had to be right, but actually incorporating ideas as they came to him. If you like this kind of refreshing conversation, that's what the members at BillWhittle.com are helping to fund and spread around the world. It may be unique, but it's something that you can be part of. Just go to BillWhittle.com and click that Become a Member link, and you can become part of the citizen producers who make this show possible. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this all happen.